Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Gimel, and Mi'etzah Hashem today we will be learning Daf Pei Hey Amud Beis and concluding what has been a very, very fascinating Siman Shin Aleph. We pick up today on near the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Aleph, 2 lines off the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Aleph Sif Mem Zayin. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunu Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayamu Bein Bayabasha, Hamakim Yerachem Alehem, V'yaitzia Mitzara L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oiro Mishiba L'Geula, Hashta Bagala Uvizman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Rufui Shalema for Rachel Shava Basitel Freda, Moshe Meir Ben Esther Fradel, Tzvi Ben Miriam, Chava Hadassah Bas Rezel Serel, Dvar Bas Shashabina, Rivka Bas Shira Leah, Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha. Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha is a dear friend who's going through a very, very difficult time. The Rebbe Shalom should have Rachmanis on him. He's a wonderful, wonderful person who has done an unbelievable amount of chesed for so many people in their times of need. The Rebbe Shalom should please give him a refuah shalema. Everyone should please have him in mind with the learning Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha. And we ask that the Rebbe Shalom should please watch over all of our brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol makom shehem. Says the Mechaber Sif Mem Zayin. We learned yesterday that when you have wet begadim on Shabbos, so an example that I keep on giving is you come home on Friday night from walking home from shul in the rain, you have a wet coat, you don't want to put it in the coat closet where it's going to get everything else wet, so you want to put it somewhere and allow it to dry. You cannot hang it in the way and in the place where you would normally hang your laundry to dry. This is a Marasayan issue. Somebody will see you hanging up wet clothing. They'll see wet clothing hanging on the clothesline. They're going to think, or they may think, that somebody did laundry on Shabbos. We discussed various heterim, what exactly you should do. Hang it in an abnormal place, hang it in an abnormal way. We also mentioned there are those poskim that say that if it's a beged that normally would be dry cleaned, we don't really have to worry that anyone is going to be choshed that it was laundered. Be that as it may, against that backdrop, the Mechaber says here in Sif Mem Zayin, he just adds a piece to this. Lo yishtach adam es kelov b'Shabbos afilu min hazeya. When we say that you're not allowed to put out wet clothing to dry because of this Maris Ayin issue, doesn't necessarily have to be that it got wet from water, that it got wet from the rain, or from falling into the lake. It could even be that it was 99 degrees and humid outside, and a beged got very, very wet from perspiration. You still cannot put it out to dry in the manner in which you would normally put out laundry to dry, because this could cause a Maris Ayin issue. Moving along to the bottom line of Pei Hey Amud Aleph Sif Mem Ches. So we learned in Sif Mem Vav, the Ramah told us that when you have wet begadim, when you have wet clothing, there is also an isser of tiltal. If it's the words of the Mishnah Berurah in Kuf Ayin Aleph were v'dafka kishenishru b'mayim merubin. When you have an article of clothing, when you have something made out of fabric that is seriously wet, you're not even allowed to be metaltal it. You're not allowed to handle it. Why are you not allowed to handle it? Because of the gzera, we're afraid that you might come lidei schita. We're afraid that you might come, when you go handle a soaking wet piece of fabric, you might come to go ahead and wring it out and be over on the isser of schita. Now, the Mechaber is going to discuss somebody who wants to dry himself off with a towel. Now, when you dry yourself off with a towel, you're getting the towel wet, and you are clearly handling the towel. Is there a gzera over here? Are we going to say that you can't dry yourself off with a towel because there's a gzera that you might come to schita? Again, after all, in Memvav we learned the Ramah said you're not allowed to handle a wet garment. Well, if you have a towel and you are making it wet by drying yourself off, isn't that a problem of handling a wet beged, or at least a wet fabric? Says the Mechaber, no. Mistapeg adam ba'aluntis, a person is allowed to dry himself off with a towel, which the Mechaber calls an aluntis. We have here in the parentheses, Pirush. What is an aluntis? Beged, it's a beged. Beged over here does not mean a garment. Beged means it's something made out of fabric. It's a piece of fabric, shemistapkin boila achar sharoichetzin, that you use to dry yourself off. Mistapeg means to dry off. This is a beged, a fabric that you use to dry yourself off after you wash, aka a towel. So the Mechaber says you are allowed to dry yourself off with a towel. Not only are you allowed to dry yourself off with the towel, so you're allowed to make the towel wet, and you're allowed to handle it, you're allowed to dry yourself off. Not only that, umevia biyadai, then you're allowed to transport it back to your home, and we're not afraid that by using the towel, by carrying the towel, which is wet, you might come to perform schita. So what's happening over here? What are we talking about? Umevia, bringing it home. Where are you going? Well, let's imagine that back in the day, back in the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rishonim, you lived in a chutzner. So you had a courtyard with a bunch of houses in the courtyard. The courtyard is surrounded by a mechitza, by a fence. The courtyard essentially is a rishos hayachid. Midaraisa, the courtyard, the chutzner, is a rishos hayachid. You're allowed to carry from the house to the chutzner, from the chutzner to the house. You're allowed to carry items in the chutzner, all midaraisa, because this is a rishos hayachid. Midarabanan, Chazal said, they made gzera, and they said you're not allowed to carry items from the house to the chutzner, from the chutzner to the house, or daled amos within the chutzner itself. Why? Because the chutzner feels and looks like a rishos harabim. After all, it's a common chutzner. It serves all the other houses in the chutzner. So it's a courtyard that is serving a rabbim. It's serving a public. If there are 20 houses in the chutzner, it's serving all 20 houses. Mir Hashem will get to Chelik Dalet. I remember I constantly used the example of a bungalow colony. You have a bungalow colony, it's got 50 units, it's surrounded by a fence. Really, the whole thing is a rishos hayachid. But the middle of the bungalow colony is a common area. It serves all of the 50 units. So it feels like a rishos harabim. Chazal were afraid if they're going to allow you to carry something from the house to the chutzner, or from the chutzner to the house, or within the chutzner itself, you might come to become confused. You may come to also transport things in rishos harabim, or from a house to a real rishos harabim, or from a real rishos harabim to a house. Therefore, you need an eruv. I don't mean the eruv string that we talk about nowadays. I mean in eruv chatzeros. Everybody has to join with an eruv chatzeros, and they have to make the whole thing one big happy family. We're not going to go into the details of that now. We'll discuss that, Mirz Hashem, more in Chelik Dalet. But now, let's imagine you live in a chutzner, and in the chutzner there's a beis hamerchatz. There's a bathhouse, maybe a mikveh that has a shower in it, right? So now, really, midaraisa, you're allowed to bathe in cold water on Shabbos. We're going to see midrabanan, not even midrabanan. The minig nowadays is that we don't bathe on Shabbos even in cold water. But really, meikar adin, you're allowed to bathe in cold water. So somebody went, let's say, Shabbos morning, he went to the mikveh, right? The mikveh is downstairs in the shul. It's all inside the chutzner. He went to the mikveh Shabbos morning. Now he comes out of the mikveh. We just learned there a halacha in Sif Memches, mistapik adam aluntis. You're allowed to dry yourself off with a towel. So he's going to use a towel when he's in the mikveh. Now he wants to bring the towel back home. Is he allowed to bring the towel home? We're not talking about hoitzah here. We're talking about there's an eruv in the chutzner. He just wants to know, can he bring it back home? What's the question? Well, are we going to make a gzera that he might come to do schita if he carries that wet towel? So these are the two halachas that the Mechaber is telling us over here. You're allowed to dry yourself off with the towel. Not only are you allowed to dry yourself off with the towel, you're also allowed to bring the wet towel home. And in neither case do we say that you're not allowed to do this because we're afraid you're going to come lidei schita. You're going to come to wring the towel out. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah near the bottom of Pei Hey Amud Aleph. Mishnah Berurah is cut in Kuf Ayin Gimel. Mistapeg Adam. Mashmi mi Magen Avram. The Chavetz Chaim says it is implied from the words of the Magen Avram. De bizman hazeh tov lehistapeg b'davar she'ein makpid al meimov. Magen Avram takes this a step further. The Magen Avram says, okay, we're not going to be choshit over here, mishum schita. We're not going to tell you, no, you're not allowed to use a towel because we're afraid you're going to come lidei schita. We're not going to tell you you have to leave the towel in the mikveh because we don't want you to carry it home because we're afraid you're going to come lidei schita. Now, we're going to see the reason for this is, right, it's a very good question. Why taka? Why don't we make this gzera? Again, we had the Ramah in Mem Vav. The Ramah in Mem Vav said you're not allowed to handle a wet beged. So if you have a wet towel, how are we allowing you to do this? Why isn't there gzera mishum schita? So really it comes down to a Ran. The Ran says in Masechta Shabbos, shekol haroichtzin mistapkin. Anybody who's going to wash himself needs to dry himself off with a towel. Im ata oiser alav lehistapeg. If you're going to tell people that they're not allowed to dry themselves off with towels, so it's going to come out af ata oiseroi berachitza. If you're going to tell people that they're not allowed to dry themselves off with towels, then you're also telling them that they're not allowed to wash themselves. Says Duran, Chazal said they cannot aser rechitza. They can't tell people that they can't wash themselves because it's efsher she'ein hadavar oimed. This is what we would call a gzera she'roiv hatzibur efsher lamed by. This is a gzera that the tzibur can't handle. The tzibur cannot handle that you're going to go tell them no more washing on Shabbos. Now you'll tell me, well, nowadays we don't take showers, we don't take baths on Shabbos. Yeah, but this, if you can't use a towel, you can't wash your face in the morning, right? You get up, you wash your face, you wash your hands, you reach for the towel. If we're going to say that you're not allowed to use towels, you're not allowed to dry yourself off at all because of a gzera that you might come lidei schita, we're going to end up prohibiting all rechitza on Shabbos. Says Duran, Chazal understood that they cannot aser all rechitza on Shabbos, therefore they did not aser drying yourself off with a towel, and they relaxed their Isser D'Rabbanan that they made because of the concern that you might come lidei schita. Say the Achronim, this is also why you're allowed to bring the towel back, because it's all of a piece. The Chazal understood, if they're going to tell you that when you go to the mikveh, okay, you're allowed to dry yourself off with the towel, but now you have to drop the towel and you have to leave it there, right? That doesn't work for people. People need to know that they can bring their towel back home. They don't want to lose a towel every week. So all of this is of a piece. It was understood that if we're going to say you can't dry yourself off, we're going to say you can't do rechitza. If we're going to say you can't bring the towel home, we're going to end up saying that you can't do rechitza. We can't ask the rechitza. Therefore, you could dry yourself off with the towel and you could bring it home. Now, the Magen Avram that the Mishnah Berurah is referring to here in Ois Katan Kovayin Gimel, what he says is, you know what? Use a towel where it's also a type of towel that you're not makpid if it's wet. Use a towel that you know you're going to go to the mikveh, you're going to get the towel wet, and it's going to remain wet. It should be something that you don't care if it's wet, because if you don't care if it's wet, that's another reason to be matir where we're not afraid you're going to come lidei schita, because you're not makpid on it. Okay, moving along to Kafayin Dalet, says the Mishnah Berurah Baluntis, you're allowed to dry yourself off with a towel. Says the Mishnah Berurah Filu Kol Gufay, you're even allowed to dry off your entire body. Now, why would you be drying off your entire body on Shabbos? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, if you bathed your entire body in cold water. In Shin Chavav, we're going to see that Me'ikar Adin, you could really take a cold bath on Shabbos. And indeed, people do go to the mikveh, right, on Shabbos morning. So Me'ikar Adin, you're allowed to bathe in cold water. Fine. We're going to see in Shin Chavav nowadays where we don't bathe even in cold water, but there is a permissible way to get your entire body wet on Shabbos, and therefore you have this heter that you could dry your entire body off with the towel. After you bathe, you could bring the towel home with you. You could bring the towel home from the mikveh that's in the chutzner to your house that's in the chutzner, so long as you have a proper iruvei chatzeros. So it's mutter to carry. And we're not going to worry that you can't carry the towel because you might come lidei schita. Even though we had the Ramon Sif Mem Vav who said you're not allowed to handle a wet beged, shani hacha. Over here it's different. Came in the hitiru asipug, since Chazal wamatu you to dry yourself off. V'loy chashashu l'schita, and they relaxed their concern that you might come lidei schita mishum de'i efsher b'li sipug, because they understood that they cannot outlaw drawing yourself off because that will equal asering rechitza. L'kachitiru gam lahavi leveisai. As part of that whole rationale, they also wamatu you to bring the towel home. Kain kasev Magen Avram, so writes the Magen Avram. Now, points out the Chavetz Chaim, following the logic of the Magen Avram, look what comes out here. Ulefi zeh, according to this Magen Avram, so let's do the math. You went to the mikveh, you're allowed to dry yourself off. Why? How come we're not afraid of schita? Because we understand we can't aser drying yourself off with a towel. If we do, we're going to aser rechitza. Okay, you dried yourself off. Now you pick up the towel and you take it home. Why are you allowed to do that? Same thing. If we're going to aser you to take the towel home, right, that's going to equal asering rechitza. Okay, so now you bring the towel home. Now you have a wet towel at home. What's the halacha now? Says the Mishnah Berurah, according to the Magen Avram, once you bring it home and you drop it in the laundry room, now shuv asr l'taltaloi. If you want to move that towel a half an hour from now, what heter is there? I understand that there was a heter to dry yourself off, because we can't aser drying yourself off. I understand that there was a heter to bring the towel home, because we can't tell you that you have to leave the towel in the Beis HaMerchatz. Okay, but now you brought it home. Now you dropped it in the laundry room. Now it's a wet beged, like any other wet beged. Comes the Ramon, Mem Vav, you're not allowed to handle a wet beged. So according to this Magen Avram, yes, you are allowed to dry yourself off, you are allowed to bring the towel home. But once you transported the towel home, that's it. Now the towel should remain muktzah for the rest of Shabbos. You shouldn't be allowed to be metaltalit. Aval, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, Be'el Yerabba, Hevi B'Shem Sefer HaTruma. The El Yerabba brings down from the Sefer HaTruma another heter over here. Says the El Yerabba, Desipuk Ba'aluntis Loi Mechshav Elikamayim Muatim. When you dry yourself off with a towel, how wet does the towel get? When you dry yourself off with a towel after a shower, right? Is the towel drenched? Is the towel soaking wet that you need to wring it out? No, it's not. It's a wet towel. If somebody else takes a shower, if you take another shower 5 minutes from now, you don't want to use the same towel because the towel's wet. But the towel's not dripping wet. It's not something that you would wring out. Let's remember that in the Mishnah Berurah on Mem Vav, in Sif Mem Vav, when the Ramah said you're not allowed to handle a wet beged, he said it's only if it's very wet. The towel that you use to dry yourself off is not very wet. So the El Yerabba says he doesn't really understand the whole concern over here. A towel that you use to dry off your body is not considered a drenched towel. That's considered a towel that's only somewhat wet. So there would be no gzera that you might come lidei schita. So it sounds, I didn't see the Sefer HaTruma inside. It sounds like what he's saying over here is, the Mechaber tells you that you're allowed to dry yourself off. Okay, that heter I really need, because how is it mutter to get a towel wet? You might come lidei schita. We don't know yet how wet it's going to get, but how are you allowed to get the towel wet? All right, you're allowed to do that because we can't aser it. Because if we aser it, we can end up asering rechitza. Bringing the towel home, you want to aser bringing the towel home because you might come lidei schita? The towel is not very wet. And then after you come home, you want to say that after you come home and you put it in the laundry room, the towel should be aser b'tiltal? Why? Because you might come lidei schita? It's not a wet towel. It's a damp towel. So therefore, he doesn't have a concern here at all. Okay, moving along. We have one phrase left here in Sif Mem Ches, top line, Pehei and Beis, says the Mechaber v'lo yimser la balonim. But one thing you should not do is do not hand off the towel to the Beis HaMerchatz or the mikveh attendants. That's the balonim. Why sheib chashudim al haschita? Because the Gemara says that the attendants in the bathhouses, they were chashud that they would come to wring out towels, and therefore do not hand it to them. Moving along to Sif Mem Tes, says the Mechaber. Mutter lirchaytz yadav banahar b'Shabbos. This is a very interesting halacha that comes in here in Sif Mem Tes that will take people by surprise. Says the Mechaber, you're allowed to go ahead and wash your hands in the river on Shabbos. Now, okay, let's break this down for a second. What potential isurim are we dealing with here? There's no isur in washing your hands, right? So, okay, what's the big novelty here? Mutter lirchaytz yadav banar b'Shabbos. You're allowed to wash your hands in the river on Shabbos. However, ubilvad, but you have to take care. Shalo yotziem im hamayim she'aleihem. You cannot then take your hands out of the river and now walk chutz lanahar, walk away from the river arba amos. So you're going for a walk over here Shabbos afternoon, and you're in the park, and there's a beautiful lake, and your hands got a little dirty. So you dunk your hands in the lake to go wash your hands. Okay, so far so good. You washed your hands. What happens if you wash your hands? Your hands are very, very wet. You have a lot of water on your hands. You don't even want all of that water on your hands. Now, if you walk Dalet Amos, you're transporting that water. You're doing a haitzah on the water. That's the chiddush over here. Says the Mechaber, yes, you're allowed to wash your hands in the nar. But after you wash your hands in the nar, now you have a hitzah problem. Now you're carrying extra water on your hands. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say that if we look at this with chelik dalid glasses, if we look at this through the lens of what kind of rishus are we in here, usually we're dealing with a carmelis. The Nahar, the river itself, a body of water, has a din of a carmelis. The river has a din of a carmelis. Carmelis is not a rishus harabim. A carmelis is a rishus darabanan. It's not a rishus harabim daraisa. So when you put your hands in the Nahar and you take your hands out of the river with the water, you're now carrying water in a carmelis. Okay. Now you bring the hands out of the river. You're standing on the banks of the river. Usually the banks of the river will also be a carmelis. Remember, Rishus Harabim Daraisa is a major thoroughfare, a thoroughfare that's used for 600,000 people, a real bona fide Rishus Harabim Daraisa. That's usually not what the banks of the river are. The banks of the river would usually be a carmelis also. Now, you're not allowed to transport something, Dalet Amos, in a carmelis. The same way you're not allowed to transport something Dalet Amos in Rishus Harabim, you're also not allowed to transport something Dalet Amos in a carmelis. So that's why the Mechaber is saying over here, you dunked your hands in the river, now you brought your hands out of the river. The fact that you're going from the river to the river bank, that's okay. The river is a carmelis, the river bank is usually a carmelis. But now if you're going to walk Dalet Amos, you're going to transport the water Dalet Amos in a carmelis, which is an Isser Durabanan. So that's what's at work here. Mutter lirchaytz yadav banar b'Shabbos. You want to wash your hands in the river, there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to take care, you have to be aware and concerned with the hitzah issue. You can't transport that water in the carmelis for 4 amos. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kuf Ayin Vav, Chutz lanar arba amos. Nokat arba amos. The reason why the Mechaber says that you can't transport it 4 amos, mishum destam mokabei abosha shal svas yamim unaharos hu carmelis. Usually, the riverbank, the beach, these would normally be carmelisin. Aval im asvasei hayu rishus harabim. But let's say you would have a weird case. I'm thinking right now of Brooklyn, New York. I'm thinking of the Belt Parkway right on the side of the water, right? Could be that you could have a real bona fide Rishus Harabim Daraisa on the banks of the river. Let's again picture this. The Nar, the river itself, has a din of a carmelis. If the river bank somehow is a bona fide Rishus Harabim, then when you dunk your hands in the river, and now you take your hand out of the river and you bring it out to you to the river bank, you just transported the water from a carmelis to a Rishus Harabim. That's an Issa D'Rabbanan. You're not allowed to transport from a carmelis to a Rishus Harabim. Ella, what should you do? Yinagve betchila heitev zu bezu ad sheyasur hamayim. What you have to do is you have to dry off your hands well one with the other. K'anahar hu karmelis, because the river is a karmelis. V'asal ha'itzi b'karmelis l'rishus harabim. You're not allowed to transport from a karmelis to a rishus harabim. So again, just to make a little bit of a sikum over here in Sif Nun, we're assuming that the river is a karmelis, the river bank is a karmelis. Okay, you could wash your hands in the river. Certainly nothing wrong with that. You take your hands out of the river, you're fine. But now you're bringing your hands to your body. You're on the river bank. Now you want to continue your walk. To continue your walk, if you walk Dalan Amis, you're transporting the water on your hands Dalan Amis in a karmelis. You're not allowed to do that. This is Rabbanan. So you have to stand still, dry your hands off, and then you could continue walking. Sif Nun, third line down in the Shulchan Aruch Pehei Amud Beis, says the Mechaber. Back in the day, sometimes there were people who had some kind of wounds on their heads. Maybe they had bald spots because of these wounds. So they would want to fill in the bald spots on their head with some kind of artificial hair. The way they would make the artificial hair is by using combed flax or combed wool. Now, this combed flax and this combed wool, these were not finished garments. These were not malbushim. They were just, so far, we're dealing with combed flax and combed wool. Now, this person wants to wear it. He wants to wear it on his head to cover up his bald spots, kind of like a toupee. He wants to wear it, and he wants to go out to Rishus Harabim. So he wants to make it a malbush, and he wants it to be mutter for him to walk with this malbush, with this toupee, Dalan Amis in Rishus Harabim. And he wants to be able to go from his house to Rishus Harabim, from Rishus Harabim to his house. So he wants this to be elevated to the level of a malbush. Now, there's another potential problem here. So far, I dealt with one potential problem. Again, I don't think I was very clear. Person has bald spots on his head. He wants to make like a toupee to wear to cover the bald spots so that the bald spots aren't recognizable. There are really two halachic challenges here. One is the challenge of Hoitzah. He wants to be able to go out to Rishus Harabim wearing this. He needs it to be a malbush. There's another problem, and that is a problem of muktzah. Regular combed wool, regular combed flax is not a garment. It's something that would be muktzah. It's not something that really has a Shabbos use. It also would be muktzah machmas chisaron kis. This is a valuable substance, a valuable item that you normally would use. Eventually, you would process this into a garment. So you don't want to just use it for anything. It's something that's muktzah machmas chisaron kis. It has a value that you put it away. You're saving it to do something with. So this is something that would be muktzah on Shabbos. So you got two challenges. You have a itzah challenge and a muktzah challenge. Says the Mechaber. Yoitzin bepishton sarek v'tzerma menuchit shebaroshin balechatotin. The people who have these wounds and these bald spots on their scalp, they could go out to Rishus Harabim with this combed flax and this combed wool. Pirish bali negoim. The Ramah says balechatotin means people that have wounds or scabs on their head. Amosai. When is this true that they could use this combed flax and combed wool as artificial hair pieces? Bisman shetzva'an ukrochan. That's only true if they dyed the flax, they dyed the wool to be the color of hair. So they did a ma'aseh to it to make it in a toupee. Oikrochan, shetzvavan ukrochan. And they tied it with a string. In other words, they assembled it. It's not just loose fibers of combed wool and combed flax. They tied it, they dyed it into a color, so they assembled it into a toupee. Now it's a malbush. Now that it's a malbush, they can go out with it on Shabbos. Or alternatively, the Mechaber gives us another eitzah. Or alternatively, even if you didn't dye it, if you put it on your head and you went out with it on Erev Shabbos, so then you already designated it as a malbush. Once you designated it as a malbush, now there's no longer a hoitzah issue because it's a malbush. There's no longer a muktzah issue because it's a malbush. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kafayim Zayin, Balakatotin, people who have these wounds on their head, Va'isin Zeh, they're doing this Kadeshi Nira Kiseir al Roishan, so it should look that they don't have bald spots. It should look like they have here. Aiskat Kafayim Ches, Shetzvan Ukrachan, they have to dye it and tie it. Hainu Shetzvan Linoi, they dye it so it should look handsome, it should look pretty. Ukrachan B'Mishicha, and they tie it with a string. So they assemble it into a toupee. The Oznechshav Kamalbush. By doing that, you turn it into a malbush. Or alternatively, or if they go out wearing it on Erev Shabbos, by wearing it as a malbush on Erev Shabbos, they have shown that it is a malbush. If it's a malbush, there's no Itzah problem, and there is no Muktzah problem. However, the mutter betiltel. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here, you don't actually have to go out with it on Erev Shabbos. Even if on Erev Shabbos you mentally designated it as a malbush. As you looked at it, yeah, that's what I'm going to use, Taka. I'm going to put that on my head when I go to shul tonight. So then already he says, if you look at Shin Ches, we'll see that already takes off the Muktzah issue. There's a Bir Halacha over here, Bir Halacha Dibra Maskil Oy Sheyatza Behen, who talks about this in greater detail. Now finally we come to the final sif of Siman Shin Aleph, Sif Nun Aleph. Mutter lotzeis b'mitznefes shetoilim b'tzavar lemi sheyesh loy maka b'yodoi oy b'zroyoi. Okay. You're allowed to go out with a sling. That's what this is. Mutter lotzeis b'mitznefes. A mitznefes is really some kind of a hat. But what is this? This is something shetoilim b'tzavar that you hang around the neck. L'mi sheyesh loy maka b'yodoi b'zroyoi. Somebody has a wound on his hand or on his forearm. He creates a sling by taking this mitznefes and hanging it around his neck and resting his arm in it. This is a sling. Says the Mechaber, you're allowed to go out with a sling. V'chein b'smartutin, you could also go out with rags, pirish chatiches beged bolui, pieces of worn out fabric, hakruchim al hayad, that are bound to one's hand, oyala etzba, or on a finger, sheyesh by makkah, with some kind of a wound. Says the Mishnah Berurah, these items are providing a function for the person. Now, they're not really malbushim, but they are being worn as garments. You're wearing it to service yourself. The sling is helping you with your hand. So this is a functional tachshit. We don't want to call it a malbush because it's not really a malbush. It's not really a garment. But it is something that you are wearing on your person to help your body. So this is what we would call a functional tachshit. So too, these rags that you have on the wound. The lashon of the Mechaber here is that the person who has the sling is l'misha yesh lo maka b'yodoi, somebody who has a wound on his hand or his forearm. Says the Mishnah Berurah, apparently there was another text that had the word roishoi instead of yodoi. Says the Mishnah Berurah, kein tzarich loymar, it's supposed to be b'yodoi. B'yodoi is the accurate text. V'chein nitfas b'oil Shabbos u'b'tei sefer Shabbos. U'mashe nimtze be'ezet tfus b'roishoi ta seferhu. The texts that have the word b'roishoi don't make any sense. You don't use a sling when you have a wound on your head. You use a sling when you have a wound on your hand or on your arm. You can go out with these rags that are on a wound on the hand. Hakruchem alayad. The words hakruchem alayad mean that the rags are tied to the hand. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ho'adin bekruchem alamaka mamish. This also would be true if the rag is only specifically on the wound itself. Chiddush over here, I don't want to go too deep into it, but the Chiddush over here is that the Magen Avram is saying that since that rag is protecting the wound, it's bottled to the wound. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here is, you notice that here at Sif Nun Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah did not say that you need to do something to these items to elevate them to a malbush the way he did in Sif Nun. In Sif Nun, he said by the artificial hairpiece, you need to dye it, you need to tie it, or at least you need to go out wearing it on Erev Shabbos in order to elevate it to the status of a malbush. Otherwise, it's not a malbush. How are you going out with it? Over here in Nun Aleph, he doesn't say that. Over here in Nun Aleph, it seems that according to the Mechaber, you don't need any of this. It's automatically a malbush. Where he brings down those who take issue with this and feel differently about it. Okay, wow. Hadran alach shin aleph, hadra chalon, daitan alach shin aleph, v'daita chalon, leinis d'shtei minan, shin aleph, v'leisis d'shtei minan, loy v'alba hadein, v'loy ba'almahu da'asi. This was a real chosheva siman. It was a pleasure learning it together with you. I hope that it came across clearly. There's this is one of these simanim where I have to say that there's so much more that's under the surface. I tried very hard to distill things down to a simple, accurate of course, but to a simply understood way that everybody should be able to follow and understand what's going on. There's a limit to how much exactly I could do within the confines of this style of a shir. I hope the Olam understood. I hope the Olam enjoyed it. Thank you so much for listening, and we should be zoichet to see the Biaskal Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.